After my wife died, I found out the secret of the room we never spoke of. When I married Amelia, I thought I was the luckiest man alive. She was really radiant, intelligent, and came from a family that seemed to have everything: prestige, wealth, and influence that stretched like invisible tendrils across the city. But beneath the surface of her family's perfect facade, there were cracks, and I don't know why, but I should have noticed them sooner. We moved into her family's ancestral estate just a week after our wedding. The mansion was enormous. It was older than anyone in her family could trace. It stood like a brooding sentinel at the edge of a dark, sprawling forest. Ivy curled hungrily up its stone walls. The windows were tall and narrow, like the eyes of some watchful creature. Inside, it felt like stepping into another era. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, and heavy velvet curtains lined the windows. Ancient oil portraits lined the hallways, stern ancestors with eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. There was no warmth in that house, just history. Heavy, suffocating history. It didn't take me long to notice this one door. It was on the second floor at the very end of the West Wing hallway, a hallway Amelia avoided entirely. The door itself was unremarkable at first glance. Solid oak, aged, with a rusted iron lock. But every single time I passed it, I felt something, like a prickle on the back of my neck, like I was being watched from the other side. One evening, out of curiosity, I reached for the handle. Then Amelia appeared out of nowhere, her hand clamping around my wrist with surprising force. "Don't," she said sharply, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. So I asked, "Why not?" startled. She swallowed, her grip still iron. "It's not safe. That room is full of stuff we promised our grandparents not to touch. Promise me you'll never open it." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I promised. For years I kept my word. But I noticed things. Amelia would stand outside that door some nights whispering words I couldn't hear. Sometimes she cried softly, clutching her stomach as though in pain. When I asked, she'd shake her head and say, "It's family business. You wouldn't really understand, don't worry." So I let it go. Then, 2 years into our marriage, Amelia became pregnant. The night she told me, there was a violent storm. Rain lashed against the windows. Lightning illuminated the mansion's hallways like strobe lights, almost like a scene from a movie. But I swear, through the crack of thunder, I heard something, a low growl echoing from upstairs. I brushed it off as my imagination. Months passed, and Amelia grew distant. She became obsessed with Caleb, even before he was born. She pored over old family books filled with strange symbols and foreign languages. She drew circles and runes on slips of paper and burned them in the fireplace. "It's some sort of tradition, it's just for protection," she said when I asked. But I noticed her hands trembling, the way her eyes darted to the door whenever Caleb kicked in her womb. Then finally Caleb was born. A beautiful baby boy with Amelia's eyes, but from the first night something was wrong. He wouldn't stop crying. Not normal crying. These were guttural, piercing wails that echoed through the entire house. Sometimes they didn't even sound human. No amount of feeding, rocking, or singing calmed him. And Amelia started unraveling. She refused to sleep. She barely ate. She would sit by Caleb's crib for hours, whispering frantic prayers in a language I didn't recognize. I'd wake up in the dead of night to find her standing outside that door again, pressing her forehead against the wood. I tried to help, but every time I asked what was wrong, she'd scream at me to leave her alone. Then one night, first an uncle, found hanged in his study. Then a cousin, her car mysteriously veering off a bridge. A great-aunt burned alive in her kitchen. It was as if some invisible hand was plucking them from existence one by one. And Caleb still cried. By then, I'd had enough. I couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. I decided to sell it and leave the country to take my son somewhere safe. But before I left, I needed answers. On our final day, I stood before the door. The rusted lock stared back at me like a dead eye. My hand shook as I reached for a hammer. One swing. The lock shattered. The door groaned open. The air that rushed out was foul, damp, sweet, metallic. The room beyond was small and windowless, lit by dozens of melted-down candles. Symbols and sigils were carved deep into the walls, blackened with age. At the center sat a large wooden cradle covered in dust. Bones littered the floor, small, fragile bones. And skulls. Dozens of tiny skulls stacked neatly in a corner. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. On the far wall, written in blood, were the words, "Sacrifice the firstborn son or suffer." My knees gave out. It all made sense. Emilia's family had maintained their wealth and power through a pact. Each generation sacrificed their firstborn son to some ancient entity, something inhuman that dwelled in the shadows of the house. But Emilia, she couldn't do it. She thought she could offer her daughter instead if she bore a girl first. But when Caleb was born, there was no escaping the price. Her refusal doomed her, and now the entity wanted what it was owed. Caleb. Suddenly the room grew cold. A whisper crawled up my spine. I turned. Caleb stood in the doorway, his tiny hand clutching the frame. His eyes, God, his eyes were wide and glassy as he stared past me. "Daddy," he said softly, "they're calling me." I followed his gaze. The air shimmered. Figures began to materialize, dozens of them. Children, pale, translucent boys with hollow eyes. Their mouths moved silently, but their voices filled my mind. Join us, give him to us." I snatched Caleb into my arms and ran. Behind me, the mansion seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut, windows shattered. The walls groaned and twisted as if in agony. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I didn't look back. I never went back. The mansion stands abandoned now. Every buyer who visits complains of sickness, of hearing children crying behind locked doors. Caleb and I moved to another country. I changed our names. We started over. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers through the baby monitor. And sometimes I see little handprints on the windows. Not Caleb's. Smaller. And I hear them, the voices. He's ours. I hold Caleb tighter. I don't know how long we can run. But I'll burn the world down before I let them take my son.